So what the sort of first thing that changed the way that I used Photoshop when I went from kind of school to being taught, actually, because I did one of my placements on it in a visualization studio, was this kind of idea of non-destructive editing, which sounds really fancy, but basically all it means is that you're always able to reverse any edits that you make to your file. So in the past, I remember I was introduced to like this, image, and then all the filters in here, so like your hue, saturation, and everything. And when you do that and you apply that to the base layer, like you're permanently changing that layer. And so other than like Control Zing, an hour later, 100 times, you're kind of, whatever you do is impacting that directly. Whereas what I learned to do is really kind of leverage the layer stack on the side here. And actually, rather than using those tools, what you want to be using are these tools. So when you select an adjustment layer, it adds it into your stack. So I'm going to go right back to the beginning of this. So just turn everything off. So this is also like, I'll get into some of the organizational stuff in a bit, but essentially what you want to be able to do is get back to the very, the raw render that you've got at the beginning, and any changes that you're making. So if I just add a curves on here, I can kind of change the contrast in here, and just turn that on and off as a layer. And that adjustment also has its own mask, which I'll get into in a sec. But you can, because that's just a separate object, it has a bunch of its own values that you can edit, tweak to soften the impact or not. So you can actually change the opacity or the fill of that layer. So if you like the effect that you've made, but you don't want to edit the graph, or you can't quite kind of tweak the graph exactly how you want, you can actually just change how kind of impactful that is on the scene. So that is the basic principle of stack things in your layer stack, and then you can always go back and undo them. And then in addition to that, there is that if you hold down Alt, you'll see, and you play kind of just between the two, there's like a little icon that comes up that allows you to link one layer down to the one below it. And what that means is that rather than that curves applying to everything below that in the layer stack, it's only going to apply it to the one that you've linked it to. So if I have this and I want to bring it into here, that's its own layer now. If I apply a kind of a hue saturation to maybe tweak the greens or something, it'll change kind of all the greens in the scene. Let me try to. So this is actually another good thing to point out. In the hue saturation, you can actually choose which channel you're impacting, rather than just like, I think if normally when you open it, it'll be in the master. So everything will go desaturated if you apply to all of it. Whereas if I just link that down to the one below, it's only it's only that layer that's being impacted. So it means that you can start kind of focusing your edits on very specific parts of the scene, which then even if they're not on their own layer, so let's say actually it's in this scene, I've saved out like these. This is one of the main benefits of having kind of render elements or channels, they're referred to in different programs will refer to them in a different way, but essentially setting up kind of color blocks within whatever you're saving out of something like Enscape will have something like this. And color coding your scene means that now I can kind of go in here and say, I just want to grab those, the greenery in the middle there, and I'm going to deselect the other stuff. But if I apply an adjustment layer with that selection enabled, you'll see like this is what a mask does. It essentially says like whatever's in white in the mask is what you're influencing, and everything black doesn't do anything to. So it's like having a selection set applied to whatever adjustments you're making. So then if I wanted to brighten up that section, it's just brightening up those things because I've selected it, applied a mask. And then the really powerful thing about masks is you can edit those as much as you like using kind of brushes. So they can be really, really powerful for blending things into each other. So generally I would recommend doing it by material. So like, you know, all your wood is a bright red, all of your glass is a bright blue, and then you've got the ability to select them in Photoshop. What I've got here is like, actually there's sort of two examples here. So this is something that I can set up in 3D Studio Max, where it's an RGB channel, which means that it's pure blue, pure green, and pure red, and I can assign different objects to those channels. And the benefit of that is that in Photoshop, you can use the RGB kind of channels to actually just directly select those without having to use like a magic wand or a lasso. So I can actually just hold down control and then click red, and it'll select just the red things in that scene. Whereas what you'll more often find is that you might be able to get something like this out, where like everything's kind of a slightly different color. You've maybe got some control over it, and you can't. If I try and do that with, you know, red here, it'll pick anything that has like a bit of red in. So you kind of can't do the same thing. So there are a few different ways that you can kind of select from something like this that are obviously going to be easier than if you select them from the base image. One of them is to use the fastest way that I use most often is just the magic wand, which is this one. I set the tolerance like quite low so that it's sort of, it's being very specific about the color band which you're kind of selecting. And then I'll use that, and it'll select, you know, all of the bits that are green, which in this case is kind of the soffit on the inside of the building. The other way to do it is you can actually do this within a selection set. But if you have this layer selected, you can go to select and then color range, and you can eyedrop a particular color, and it'll allow you to kind of adjust exactly which color you want to select. So having something that is representative of your objects in a really flat way that are color coded should be possible from almost any software that you use. Like, it's a very common kind of industry standard. But being aware of it, setting it up, and then that being part of your process makes your life so much easier, because you do end up doing that, like, you know, cutting out within the scene manually changes. And if you're doing that kind of photo montage into line work, you know, if you have a kind of color blocked version of that, it just means that you can be very specific about where you're applying, you know, your materials. And then using the masks makes that even easier, because if I just start a new file. If you're kind of trying to apply, you know, material into this, you know, I can create a mask so that even if I wanted to just use a brush to paint in something, I can paint over here, but nothing will appear. But oops, sorry, I'm at the mask. Change color. But I can paint in, and that mask is defining kind of, you know, where I can actually impact, you know, the scene. So this is really powerful for, like, actually, if you're doing those photo montages, the combination of masks and brushes are really powerful, because you'd be amazed what you can get away with when you have a soft edge to something. So let's just drop this into here. So I'm kind of making this up as I go, so bear with me. Let's say I wanted the ground to be kind of, you know, the grass in here. You just stretch that until it's sort of covering roughly the right area. And then if I create a mask and then I fill that with black, it'll hide the whole thing. And then what I could do is either use my selection sets, or I can start painting this in where I want to see the grass. And that's something that's like, you know, as soon as I get a bit wrong, I can come back and edit that, because it's just a, you know, flipping between black and white on the color in the mask. So I could probably got some stuff in here. I can kind of make sure I'm chopping out. So I can either use that, and then so X is quite a handy shortcut. It just flips between your foreground and background on the over here. So I can just cut out that stuff, and then, you know, you're kind of quite a long way there quite quickly. And then that's where, you know, being able to tweak the color of that, but just that specifically, you know, if I wanted to push that to be a little bit more yellow, maybe desaturate it a bit, I can then also apply curves. So curves is something that I didn't know about really before. I used brightness and contrast was the equivalent that I would use most of the time. I almost never use brightness and contrast now, and the curves is really, really powerful tool. And essentially what you're seeing here in that, like, this is what they call a histogram, that you can actually pull up as one of the like windows to view the image histogram. But essentially what the histogram represents is the far left is your darks, and the far right is the whites. So it's kind of a black to white scale, and it kind of shows you the distribution of, like, you know, so in this case it's saying actually there's quite a lot in this very dynamic range, but like most of the image is kind of in this sort of lower quarter range. And what the curves does is just allows you to kind of tweak. So the most common edit using a curves is to kind of, if you want to increase the contrast a little bit, you kind of darken the lower quartile of the of that diagonal, and then they call it an S curve. So you're kind of brightening the top corner and you're darkening the bottom corner. So you can be very subtle with this. There's also this is quite powerful if you want to be really, really specific about it, but you can use this sort of finger pointer, and if there's a part of the image that you're like, actually I really want that range to be slightly brighter, you can kind of click on that and it'll select where where that sits in the dynamic range, and then I'm dragging that up, so anything that's sort of in that range. I mean, I'm just impacting the graphs here, but that's just a handy kind of additional tool. But say in this case, maybe I want the grass to be darker, but not everywhere. It means that even within that layer, I can then, if I change the opacity of my brush, I can actually erase where it's impacting the so I'm just painting in kind of black on that mask. Oh, that's another shortcut. So if you want to view the mask, you can just hold down Alt and then click on the mask, and you can actually work in here if you want. But it's quite a good way to just see, preview the mask basically. So actually, if I made that much darker, so you can see what I'm doing a bit more. You can see it's sort of all of a sudden it looks like there's a natural sort of lighting distribution across that grass, and these are just adjustment layers I can turn on or off. Same with the grass. So that's like a really good mini example of kind of using the stack to add adjustments, link them down to, you know, a particular layer, and then using the masks to, you know, achieve what you want, but where you want it. You just have like so much more control without ever having to say, you know, impact the you know, the original version. You know, I can turn that mask off and see the original image. So those are some of the like masks and the adjustment layers and the layer stack are kind of really core to like, you know, getting the most out of Photoshop and giving yourself the control and you know, backwards compatibility that you want, because it allows you to test things as well. You know, you can go down a rabbit hole and then go, actually I don't know about that, or like you come back to a part that you worked on earlier and say, actually I want to tweak that because I've shifted the colors in a different direction. So let me just check. Grouping is just a really good way to organize the file, but it also, you can use groups in a way that, you know, say I've put this grass edit into the people layer, but if I call that, you know, just call that grass. You can also link adjustments to entire groups. So if I put that curves layer on top of the group, I can apply that to the whole group. So anything in that layer will be impacted by this. And it's not unusual to see like multiple kind of curves or multiple hue adjustments or color balances on like stacked on top of each other. You know, generally it makes sense to try and tweak the original one, but sometimes you just need to nudge it a little bit. So, you know, it's not like I've got the curves in here that's doing something, but then maybe I decide that that whole layer wants to be tweaked a little bit. I can apply that to the group. And the same is also true with the masks. So you can apply a mask to a whole group, but then apply it to everything inside it. So yes, I want to cut these back out. I can put that in here, like fill that in black. It'll chop those pieces out. So the mask for that group then looks like this. So groups are just another way of organizing your file. I have an action script that I use every time, which just gives me this folder structure, which is what I typically will use for my Photoshop files, where I've kind of got everything that I probably want from the core render in a render folder. So this is where actually I'll walk you through this. So that's kind of my base, you know, raw render that comes out the rendering program. So in my case, from Corona and 3D Studio Max. And in here, I'll normally have a ambient occlusion layer. So that in this case is just looks like that, which is a bit like what you might, you know, get out of Enscape. Then I've got a refraction pass, which basically shows me everything that's passing through a refracted layer. So, you know, basically glass, sometimes water. And then I've got a reflection pass as well, which shows me all the reflected materials in the scenes. And there are a few others that I would use. One of them might be in here. Yep, this one, which is really helpful if you can get an equivalent to this out of your render, whatever you're rendering with. It's really powerful. So this is called a Z depth. And basically it renders from black to white, you know, the front to the back of your scene, and you normally have the ability to control how far away you want to set the back and how far away you want to set the front. So this is really powerful for, well, as you probably imagine, adding some like atmospheric depth to a render. But it's also really powerful if you can find this one. It's super powerful because not only does it allow you to kind of, I guess in this instance, if I So this is where starting to use blend styles, like layer styles, is really helpful. So you'll probably be familiar with some of these, but that's what this like really long list is at the top of your layer stack. And basically what all of these do is they dictate a set of rules about how that layer interacts with the layers below it. So the most useful one, particularly in architecture, is to know about multiply, because what multiply does is it allows you to drop anything that's black onto the layers below, but it ignores anything that's white. So if you have drawings or sketches that you want to drop onto a sheet and you want stuff to happen underneath them, you just put them on a multiply layer and then the white disappears. You don't have to like cut out the lines, which is, I remember showing people this who'd spent hours trying to cut out, you know, sketches, and you know, you just turn it onto a multiply layer and it's it just drops the white out. Sometimes you have to kind of clean that up. So this is actually a good use for what levels does. So levels is another adjustment layer. It's available down here next to your curves. And what levels does is it essentially, you see the histogram up here. Let me just put a new one on so you can see it from scratch. So if I drop that on here and I link it down, you'll see that, you know, that's the black to white spectrum in that image is actually going kind of more from like a gray to white, and that you can see that. So like the histogram is kind of starting slightly further in from the left hand side, so that would be black. And so what you can do is you can narrow the range that Photoshop is showing you in the spectrum, and the easiest way to see what I mean is actually just to play around with these values. So if I shift this in, basically it moves the black point in that image to being kind of, you know, it starts at black basically, and then depending on where you put the midpoint, you can start pushing, you know, where the white is and where the black is. So this, for example, so if I turn these two off and apply this on top of if I change this to a screen, it basically does the opposite to a multiply. It lets the white sit on the page and the blacks get dropped out. So you're only applying the kind of white elements. So with regards to a Z depth, what this means is you using the combination of levels, if I apply that to there, I can basically make it foggier or less foggy depending on that levels layer, because it's just pushing that like amount of fog basically, you know, further forward or further back. And then if it's, you know, a bit too intense, you can just reduce the amount that's kind of impacting the scene or visibility. I mean, opacity and fill are, to be honest, I've never really gone to the bottom of what the difference between the two of them is. I use fill more often than opacity, but they do very similar things. But you can see that just allows you to add a little bit of sort of atmospheric depth, which this is an unusual example because it's kind of an interior scene, but you've actually got quite a long perspective into the outside space. So images tend to look just a lot more convincing if you have some difference between the kind of the level of intensity of color, and particularly darks should always be like darker in the foreground and paler and less like contrasty in the background. And this just gives you an additional way of doing that kind of in Photoshop. So that's one of the steps that I will nearly always go through in the initial setup to try and work towards, you know, setting up the render. What was I going to say? The other benefit of having the Z depth layer is if I turn this back to just normal and full fill, is that if you imagine what we discussed with the masks, you've got an ability to kind of select or apply an effect or an adjustment to like parts of your image from front to back. So I'll try and show you an example of this. So say I just want to impact the like foreground of my scene with an edit. If I invert this, so Control I, and then I use the levels to shift this so that it's just the foreground that's white. And actually, I'm going to try and remove as much of the background as I can. So, like, say that's the bit that I really am focusing on impacting. If I select all of that and copy it, actually, it's copy merged. So up here, that would be next to, but just below the regular copy, it has its own shortcut. But essentially what that does is like whatever you're seeing on the screen, it'll copy that rather than just the layer that you're working on. So if I then just turn that off and then create a, I'll do, what's gonna be easiest thing? If I just do hue saturation, drag that out. And then if I view that mask, which just comes in as white, and I paste that Z depth kind of preview that we've set up into the mask, when I then change the saturation of the foreground, it's just impacting kind of the immediate foreground. So I probably wouldn't desaturate the foreground. What I Control click also, by the way, is a great way. Like that basically selects everything in that mask. So I can use that to kind of actually what I probably would use this for is a curves. And actually I want the foreground to be, a lot darker. I can do that because the curves is only impacting what's white. And what that means is that like these people down here, they're being impacted like 50% by those rules because they're gray. So it's not like it's pure white and then pure black. It's actually, it impacts things relative to the point on that spectrum. So that's another really powerful use that you get out of having kind of that additional information that if you can save that out. Okay. So actually, let me go through the blend styles a little bit more. So reflection is a good one because that introduces us to another blend style. So in this list here, there is a logic to how they're organized. So the top ones are its variations on the whites get left out and the darks do something to the layers below. The next section is the opposite. So the lights impact the layers below and the darks get dropped out. The next section is it's a blending of both. And then I don't really know, these have very specific uses that I haven't really come across a use for them yet. But generally, so I used screen for the Z depth because it's kind of a softer version of what is linear dodge, which is considered like pure addition to like the intensity. So if you're adding a white onto a linear dodge, it's basically gonna amplify whatever's already white in the layers below. So if you're adding light passes, so that's what I've got probably down here. So that's just the environment light, which isn't that helpful. But this is another really great thing that might be more specific to V-Ray and Corona, but you can actually save out specific light elements where, like, I've got a bunch of interior lights that are on a render element, and it'll give me just what they're doing in the scene as a separate element, which I can then use to kind of amplify that lighting in the Photoshop file. So the benefit to that is that you can essentially turn off all your lights, save them out individually, and then add them back in, almost like you've got a dimmer switch in the Photoshop file. But I would use this if I wanted to if I wanted to amplify that light in this scene, if I drop that on top, but I change it to the linear dodge add, that's like the most intense version of, you know, how that is added to the scene essentially. And so you'd very rarely leave that at 100%. You probably, you know, you're probably in the 20s to 30s range, but it really depends on how bright or how much you want that to impact the scene. And the same is true for like reflection pass. So say I wanted to amplify the reflections in the scene, I could do the same here. So like it's going to take the brightest parts that you can see in those reflections and amplify them. So you'll see the reflection on the in this corner get really blown out, but again you can soften that by just decreasing the strength that's kind of impacting the scene. You can also, so let's just toggle through them. Color dodge is a slightly different set of rules for the same thing, and sometimes just flicking through these to see what looks best is actually the best way to do it. Screen is softer, lighten is softer again, so they sort of work in that spectrum. But generally, start with linear dodge if you're kind of wanting to brighten up parts of your scene, and then what I will do is, so ambient occlusion, which is this one. Let me drop that to the top. So this one's a really good example of using the multiply. So if I just switch that to multiply, you'll basically see kind of the, you know, just the grayscale kind of being applied. And ambient occlusion is really good just for giving you a little bit of grain into the corners of the image, stops it looking quite so flat. So it's great for diagrams as well, but in visuals, that is quite helpful just to have that as something that you might, you know, I'll normally drop this down to like 20%, and I'll probably erase it from certain parts of the scene using the mask. So because of the nature of how ambient occlusion is kind of calculated, which in this case is slightly spoiled because I've got a huge pane of glass right in front of the courtyard and it's not seeing through that. But on foliage and leaves and grass and stuff, it can get very dark. So sometimes you just want to like brush that out to reduce the impact. So I'll always have on the top of my like Photoshop file somewhere, I'll have this black and white or hue saturation with a lower saturation. And it's really just to like check the values. And it's something that you get better with over time, like kind of knowing what looks about right. But you know, the way I've always thought about it is that if you can switch your image to black and white and it looks like a great black and white photograph, then you're in the right territory. But there are some rules like how you can evaluate that, and then obviously there's ways that you can kind of adjust that as well. So let's say this is quite a high contrast image, whereas the other one I was going to show you is a much foggier kind of atmospheric view. And actually, if you look at the black and white, this is where it's meant to be. The blacks actually aren't that black, and actually, if we look at the histogram, you might be able to see that. Yeah, there's like a missing section in this here, which suggests that like, so if I adjust this to make it a bit punchier, so in that case, I would be pulling this down to get the darks a bit darker, and then I'd pull that up so that my brights are also filling this last segment, making it a bit brighter. You can see how that histogram sort of starts to fill in the last sections, but it was an aesthetic, you know, decision for me to say, like, this is cool, but actually I kind of prefer the way that it's softer because it's in the fog and it's sort of intentionally not meeting the ends of those spectrums. So it's always there are two brushes, little toolbars that you probably want to be aware of that I probably keep in your sidebar. One is the presets. So that's like, you know, being able to toggle between a hard and a soft brush quickly. And then you can load in additional brushes. Photoshop has loads now. I've downloaded my own, like, you know, tests from other people whose work I really like. I can make these available to you, if you want. If I just switch this to white, actually before I do that, so the presets is helpful, but really understanding kind of what's going on in a brush. So if I just go back to just the basic one, so I think by default you'll normally have it on soft round, which, you know, up here you might be familiar. You can change kind of the size, but also the hardness, which is basically just the fuzziness around the edge of the brush. So if you get a full hardness, you'll get a really hard edge. Softness, you'll get the lovely haziness. But then within the brush settings, there's a lot of stuff that you can do and change and tweak, and you can do that to presets as well as your own. And there's also kind of an overwhelming amount of choice in terms of like what your brush shape is to begin with, and it can be quite distracting depending on what you're trying to achieve. So generally, the soft round brush or the hard round brush is like going to solve 90% of scenarios that you want, and actually 90% of those are just the soft brush. But there are a couple, like the grass one, which looks super basic. If I just brush that as it is, it's just going to give me a series of exactly the same shape, size, angle grasses. But if you start leveraging these, it gets really powerful. So if I turn on shape dynamics, I can adjust so as I brush it, it'll tweak the scale of that brush as I brush it. So you'll see that kind of start to already look a little bit more nuanced. I can then
dynamics.
So if I go here, and if you can't see this, you want to go up to here and then brush settings.
Okay.
And then it should give you access to a little toolbar. When you're in here, basically what this will do is it'll ask you the brush tip shape. You can choose the shape that you want to use, and there's loads that are just by default in Photoshop, and the grass is one of them. Then you can start kind of adding settings to that brush. So size shape dynamics is the first window. So your size jitter. You can then do the equivalent with angle, which in this case you don't want to go all the way around, but you might want to just vary it a little bit. So that again starts to kind of give you a little bit more variation. So I use this and have used this for a long time for, if you've dropped a picture of grass into your image that you want to Photoshop in and you want to soften those edges, this is perfect for that. You just, add a bit of variation to the brush, use the white, pure white, and you just brush it, back in, and you get that soft kind of hazy edge. Round the jitter, I think that might be more relevant to, I think that's like flattening and shortening it. It's like kind of rotating it that way. You can also actually, in the brush tape shape, you can use this to change like the general angle, which can be quite helpful if you're trying to feather in a particular edge rather than just up to down. You can flip those on, and then the spacing is, you can actually just spread them out, which in this case you probably don't want to do. You want to have them quite close. But that can also be used for, like, if we did the hard round, I could turn off the size jitter, turn off the angle, but space these out. I can draw it like a dotted line just with the brush. So you can kind of do whatever you like. The other one that's good to know about is, so scattering kind of just adds a little bit more variation. So I can turn this size back on, the angles back on. then go to scattering and say, actually, I want them to be a bit more random, but I want a bit more of them, so I'm going to increase the count. Then you get kind of something that's more like this. So that's a good use. There is I think there still is. There is a leaf-shaped brush that can be quite used for just for doing the equivalent on like masking trees or bushes or plants. There's quite a good checklist just to be conscious of when you're thinking about, like, you might have like your most beautiful image set up, you're ready to just do the last stage, which is, you know, people, and then like final tweaks, whatever it is. The first thing you think about is like the people that you're choosing. Makes a huge difference to how well or how easy it is to get them to sit into the scene. And that might sound really obvious, but it's amazing how often that is not done, even at like super professional level. And it's really basic things like, what is the atmosphere that you've painted? Like, where is the sun coming from? Is it a bright day? Is it a winter day? Is it a summer's day? You know, like, what is the atmosphere that you've created? Do the people that you're selecting kind of marry up with that atmosphere, time of day, place? Because there's nothing worse than like, oh, look at all these people playing in the park, and there's like a guy in an anorak, you know, with a beanie on, who looks like he's just walked out of like Russia. They just stand out immediately like a sore thumb. So literally clothing is like, you know, a real kind of should be a qualifier for like when you're choosing people for a scene. The sun direction, light direction is a big one, because that's really difficult to change. And when you drop people in a scene and the shadows coming from the wrong side, it can be quite difficult to know what's wrong, but that's what's wrong. So being conscious of that if you're flipping people, and, you know, where is the shadow on them and where is the sun on them, and how do they sit in your scene, is a really important one to be conscious of. Color is actually a really good thing to keep an eye on, because generally as you're working towards creating an image, there's like a harmony in the colors that you're putting together, and you'll have resolved that to get to the point where you're really happy with the image. And dropping in a bunch of people that have like bright colors that maybe jar with the image can really upset the way that they sit in the image. So just being conscious of that, and that's something that can be adjusted in Photoshop, but you want to be aware that you need to do it if you're going to drop that person in, because they might be like the perfect person, but they're wearing like a bright pink t-shirt. So you just need to like reduce the pink in that person in their t-shirt. I'll go through I'll try and run through quickly how I would go about doing that in a sec. The other thing is contrast on a character, like depending on where they are relative to like the foreground to the background, you want to make sure that they're sitting in the scene, and the best way to do this is actually to check that the black in that person matches up with like the blacks that are naturally in your render at that point in the scene, and they'll be more gray the further back you get, and depending on the scene, sometimes they'll be more blue. And then adding shadows, being conscious that sometimes if you're in a very strong sun environment, like this one's actually probably not a great example, or the other one, because it's quite diffuse light, which is a lot more forgiving, which is also worth bearing in mind, because sometimes that is a really lovely light condition to work in, and it's a bit more forgiving in terms of like dropping people in. But if you have, you know, harsh, strong shadows in your scene, then the people will need quite strong contrast and, you know, directional light, and probably a shadow. And depending on where you're sourcing your people from as well, like, so, you know, there's a lot of great like assets out there where they'll give you the shadow with the person, and they'll even tell you kind of roughly where the sun is, you know. And there's like probably like a 45-degree, you know, tolerance, where like if it's roughly coming from the right direction, you'll be fine, but if it's like the wrong side, it'll just look wrong. I think those are like most of the and then scale is really important to get that right, because it's really easy to get it wrong. And then the easiest way to get it wrong is if your camera like the view that you take in of your space, if that's not at eye level, it can be much more difficult to guess or gauge how big somebody should be, you know, where, depending on where they are in the scene. If you get the camera at eye level, it's a lot easier because your horizon line and where all of your perspectives kind of merge, which can be, you know, I've literally done it with a piece of paper on my screen before just to check. The horizon line is where you want like the eye level to be of all your characters. So if it's certainly easier if you have your camera at eye level perspective, and there's a lot of reasons why you generally want that to be the case anyway, but there's always exceptions to that. Sometimes you just can't capture what you need to at eye level. Eye level images are just always more engaging because it feels like you're in the scene. As soon as you start floating around, you kind of detach that human experience from how you're telling the story. So just another one to be conscious of. Let me
say also, yeah, eye level, but what other camera settings for like exterior perspectives, like depth of field and local, like what kind of settings do you normally use?
So yeah, your options are normally like parallel perspective, or sometimes that's called orthogonal, which is where like everything's straight, and it's great for diagrams, but you basically never use that for perspectives because it's not perspective. Then you've got 2-point perspective, and what's the other one this one's called? Parallel perspective. I've to be honest, like either of those are fine. The thing that you probably want to be conscious of is just being able to set your field of view, and try and treat it a little bit like you've got a camera, and like a normal camera rather than a fisheye lens, because there's a temptation to try and capture like as much as possible in one view, like, and then what happens is you really stretch the stuff that's on the edges and it looks weird. And also, if you're doing that, you're probably better off trying to frame a specific message and then another specific message, rather than one image that's trying to capture everything, because when you do that, you also kind of lose what the focus is, like what is the story you're trying to tell, because you're trying to tell too many stories. So rule of thumb, and this depends on what your settings are and how you control it, but actually let me just check. I try to never go beyond like a 20mm lens, which is a field of view of so like a 20mm lens, so that's focal length, is the equivalent of like an 83-degree or H4 field of view. So you're seeing kind of almost 90 degrees. I think when you go lower than, so in camera millimeters, if you go lower than that, it gets wider. It starts to get a bit sort of stretched out. And then I generally, like, I mean, if you go up to like 50, you're getting quite narrow, and they're really powerful for if you're trying to capture a moment. Like actually having those longer lenses is really it's a great way of doing that, which you probably won't need to deal with so much. But I'd say if you try and keep to framing whatever you're doing within an 80-degree field of view, you're in about the right territory.
Thank you.
Because it's really easy to do in, like, I think in SketchUp was really bad at this as well. You've got like 120-degree field of view, and it's like, oh great, I can see everything, but not great for kind of storytelling and setting up compositions. I mean, with regards to the people, all the things I've gone through earlier kind of apply specifically. You know, that they're all really relevant. Let me just drag a cutout person into here, and I'll kind of try and show you what I mean.
Sorry, I have to go now, but I just want to say thank you.
No problem. Good luck with the deadline.
Thank you. Yeah, bye.
play. Try and choose the right person now. Let's try these two. Okay, so starting point, like she got bright red t-shirt on, it's not ideal. Also, I'd probably say the light is coming from the left, so try and flip those so it looks like at least like she's maybe walking alongside the edge of the glass. When I do this, I quite often pull a ruler down. If I've got any 3D people, it's obviously helpful because then I can sort of see, all right, roughly that's sort of eye level, which means that I need to kind of want them to be just back here, kind of being about there. It's probably about right. And this is where I'd probably start with applying curves and linking it down to them, and probably reducing the intensity of kind of the brightness. Maybe softening the blacks. I can add a mask to their layer where I need to cut her out. So if I just, that's quite handy to know about as well, actually. In the magic wand, you have this setting for contiguous, which means that like if that's on, I'll only select like that part of the red, whereas if I turn it off, any red will get selected across the scene, which is quite handy. So if I grab her, go to my mask and say, yeah, I want that bit to be black. That's another shortcut as well. Shift backspace, it just pulls up the fill command, and then you can choose. I nearly always have this just left on foreground color, and then I can toggle with the X, which to make that black. So then she's kind of chopped out those. This is kind of an interesting one because the light is so diffuse that sometimes what I would do is I'd copy a version of them, and then I'd distort this. So that's Control-T to transform, and then I basically stretch them around until I had the shadows kind of where I felt like they needed to be, which when you've got two people is more difficult because they probably need to be edited separately. But let's just say the sun was doing that. So I kind of get them roughly where I needed them to be. And then this is actually the only time I do this, but I'll do it in here anyway. I'd normally just apply this directly to that layer, but if I just reduce the saturation, and then actually what I do is I quite often go all the way to black, so just darkness, so lightness goes all the way down to the bottom, and then I'll add another one that just lifts that a little bit, so it's not so they basically, there's like a gray, and then I'll use the blur, Gaussian blur, just to kind of basically soften that. So that might be, depending on how precise you want to be, sometimes I'll do two of these. So one will be for like closer to their feet, and one will be for further away, and then I'll blend between the two. But essentially what you're trying to do is just soften, soften the shadow, which is normally more realistic. And then the shadow I would put on a multiply layer so that you're allowing the stuff from below to impact it. And then depending on what I'm trying to achieve. Ooh, I still got my leaf. Okay, just back to soft round. I'd use another mask on the to kind of maybe make it stronger at the bottom and soften it. So that's how I do it on, like, if it was sunnier outside and I needed like a, full shadow. In this case, because it's not, I'd probably just paint something in and just put that, underneath them. So it's quite helpful actually. When I used to do this a lot more, I'd always like group the people. So in here, I'd probably just, it's just see down here. And you can be quite kind of rough initially with it, because then you can just go back and so then I'd soften that with a mask again. Or maybe just like knock it back a bit. And then if I was trying to sort out her color on her t-shirt, I'd either like select specifically. I mean, I'd control click that layer to get both of them. So I guess I could just chop out the bits there. The danger with red is that you end up removing all of the warmth from people's skin, and then they look a bit zombie-like. Wrong way. Forgive me, wrong. Okay, and then adjustment layer, red. Make it a bit more orange, which is closer to the palette in the scene. So then, yeah. Ooh. I think I've just detached that's something to be aware of. If you unlink, like I accidentally kind of unlink that top one, and then it means it's applying that adjustment to the whole scene. She could do it being a little bit brighter. And actually the blue's quite strong. So those are the steps, basically. And hopefully kind of familiarizing yourself with the masking and the adjustment layers kind of gives you the control that you need to kind of get to the point, but then sort of having an idea of what your checklist is like you're doing yourself a favor, because sometimes there's no amount of Photoshop you can do that will make somebody fit in that scene. And the last thing that I do on this sometimes is just create a new layer, just a blank layer, and I'll just with black and white on quite a soft opacity, I'll brush in kind of where I think that the light's coming from, but I'll also do the equivalent on like the shaded side. So something really roughly like that, which then if you put that onto a soft light, it sits into the character and just kind of gives them a slightly more directional light. And depending on how strong you want that to be, you can just fade that again.